It is the case, and Genesis is fairly clear about this, that in the flood of Noah, that species pairs were put on the ark 2 by 2. Actually, there's a distinction between clean animals and unclean animals, and I'm not sure what that is, but unclean animals were brought on 2 by 2, and yes, clean animals, I think in pairs of 7 or 6 or something. I don't remember exactly. And that with regard to the human population or human sample on the ark, there was Noah and his wife, his 3 sons and their wives. Now, this is a population bottleneck, which according to the Genesis hypothesis occurred 4,000 years ago. And among other things, it would mean that there was only a single Y chromosome, that is Noah's male sex-determining chromosome. And I haven't done the calculations exactly, but we could. I mean, we could actually test this hypothesis. We could calculate how much genetic diversity there should be in modern populations, applying the uniformitarian principle of science, which I claim is essential if you're doing science, which would be to base it on mutation rates that we measure in the laboratory. And we could calculate what the genetic diversity of human populations ought to be. And where we want to look first, as I said, is at the Y chromosome, then the mitochondrial genome, because it's transmitted only through the females. We'd have even a smaller bottleneck there. And then we would want to look at the nuclear genes. But I claim, without having the data in hand, that the genetic diversity in human populations vastly exceeds a bottleneck of that sort. If we had really gone through the Noachian bottleneck, then heart transplants would not be near the problem they are today. The problem with all tissue transplants, heart transplants, liver transplants, has to do with the enormous diversity of the major histocompatibility genes. There are more histocompatibility alleles than it seems plausible could have come through that bottleneck. And not only that, there are histocompatibility genes within humans that are more similar to histocompatibility genes within gorillas than they are to other histocompatibility genes in humans. There's this enormous diversity, and I don't understand how that could have come through the bottleneck of that size. So I want you to address the problem of defining kind such that we can look at how genetic diversity ought to be partitioned between kind species and within species, and then address this problem of the seemingly excessive genetic variation.
Okay, I'd be glad to do that. We've got quite a few questions have come in, right?
Yeah, if you don't mind, we appreciate all that you all have done, and we all enjoyed it very much. Like maybe we give them all a big hand. If you would take just a moment, Dr. Hovind, to respond, and then I have a few questions from the audience. What I would ask in advance is, in an effort to get some questions through, if you could keep your responses, both of you, down to about 3 minutes so we can get a few questions through. I'd certainly appreciate it. And for the audience, we'd appreciate it if you'd hold your response until the end to give us optimal time for these questions. Thank you.
Okay, you asked what is a kind. I've told you several times I don't know for sure. If I had to pick something, I would say it's closer to our current divisions of family as opposed to species. You've never given a definition of species, and you made a big deal about you have made a big deal about making predictions, yet the evolutionists do not make predictions. I will give you some predictions based on the Genesis account. I would predict that because of this worldwide flood, we should find lots of fossils all over the world, zillions of them, things that are dead. We should find layers of coal and natural gas and oil from the plants and animals that were buried in this flood. We should find sedimentary rock over most of the earth. We should find fossil seashells on top of major mountain ranges all over the world. That's a prediction, which obviously is true. I mean, everybody knows, that's the way it is. So I think that's a reasonable prediction from Genesis. You mentioned about Noah taking species on the ark. I didn't use the word species, and he didn't use the word species, and God didn't use the word species. God says 2 of every sort and 2 of every kind. Sorts and kinds are the only words used to describe these animals. So your whole effort seems to be to try to box somebody into a corner to make a definition of kind, when yet you're not willing to do that on species. And then if somebody did make a definition of kind, like I said, okay, if I had to, I would say probably more like a family, you will then devote enormous amounts of research to determine how that could be wrong, and yet you won't devote the same amount of research to study how your idea could be wrong of evolution. It's very one-sided here. It seems to be more anti-creation than it is pro-science. I would point out, as far as the bottleneck of coming through Noah's family at the flood, all of us coming from a rock is an enormous bottleneck, which is what the evolutionist ultimately believes. We all came from a single common ancestor. You talk about a bottleneck, that's just simply not possible. You mentioned about the carbon dating. You may be aware that when Richard Leakey found the skull, KNM ER 1470, found 1972, it looked like modern humans, but it was found under the KBS tuft. Now, the KBS tuft had already been dated by potassium-argon dating from Nature magazine, April 18, 1970, page 226. It had been dated at 212 million years old. This date had been verified several different ways. Everybody accepted the date of the KBS tuft at 212 million years old until they found the human skull underneath. The only way they knew the potassium-argon date was wrong was the fossils didn't match the theory. So evolution, assumption, was the driving force to change the date of the KBS tuft. It was dated numerous times. There's quite an article about it in here. 10 samples were dated and ranged from 0.52 million to 2.64 million, a wide range of dates, and that's all the data right here. I'll be glad to I'll let you see this afterwards. So I think it'd be a false characterization to say that carbon dating is consistent or that anything about it is consistent. The theory of evolution and the assumption of how old the thing should be based on the layer it's in, that drives the consistency, because only the dates that agree with the theory are published. Well, that's not science. That's they did the same thing in the Soviet Union. Find a teacher 10 years ago, and get a teacher and put him in the Soviet classroom 10 years ago, have him stand up and say, boys and girls, I don't think communism works. I think capitalism is a better theory. What would happen to that teacher? Well, he'd be shoveling snow in Siberia if he survived. And I would be willing to make a prediction that if a teacher in this university stood up and said in their class, I don't think evolution, the macroevolution, is a reasonable theory. I think it's never been observed. It's purely a religion. I think creation's a better explanation for how we got here. He wouldn't be shot or go to Siberia, but he'd probably lose his job.
I would be willing to bet the $10,000 you have on the table that wouldn't happen if the faculty member had tenure. Even if he didn't, it simply wouldn't happen.
Are you familiar with Dean Kenyon at Stanford University? Dean Kenyon wrote books about evolution. He was a strong supporter of evolution. He got converted and became a creationist. He wrote the book of Pandas and People. They tried to fire him, but he was already tenured. Stanford University, they made him a lab assistant. Call Dean Kenyon and ask him if there's any prejudice against creationists. 10,000.
Do I get time to...
If you wouldn't mind, I'd just like to give you
15 seconds.
All right.
Which again is, I caution you to check the factoids always, mine as well as Kent's.
Agreed.
And I'd be interested in talking to Dean Kenyon if you'll give me his phone number, or email, or address.
Sure. And I can give you a list of others who've been censored over creationist teaching. But anyway, let's take some of the questions here.
A couple questions from the audience, and once again, so that we can get a couple of these through, we'd like to ask that you limit your answers to about 3 minutes. The first question is directed to Dr. Hovind. The question is that you keep stating that evolution is a religion. In order to help explain this, could you please give us a definition of religion and explain how evolution fits into this definition?
I would say a religion, by that I mean something you have to believe in without any empirical scientific evidence. I guess I would contrast science, things that we can observe, test, demonstrate, with religion as in something we have to believe in, but you cannot see it or observe it, for instance. So I guess that may be a loose definition of religion. Webster's dictionary definition is, a religion is belief in a divine creator or creators that brought the universe into being. So the evolution theory is a belief in how the universe came to be. So it fits all the criteria of a religion with the Webster's dictionary definition.
Dr. Moore, a response perhaps at why it is not a religion?
The theory of evolution by natural selection is not a religion because it's falsifiable. And it has, even beyond that, it is a valid scientific theory in that it has withstood numerous tests of its falsifiability. I can conceive of data right now that we might gather that would convince me that, or would in effect falsify the theory, and it would have to do with finding this pervasive pattern of homology among genes. Again, when the molecular era, the era of molecular genetics dawned on us, it was conceivable that we would begin to look at genes and that we would find that there was no pattern of relatedness among them. And if that had been the case, I would have given up the idea of evolution immediately. And I want to mention another point that we really should talk about and we haven't, and that is what empirical evidence is. It seems to me as there's an abundance of empirical evidence, not only for macroevolution, but for the connection between macro and microevolution. And so in order to say that macroevolution is not a science, or that it's a religion, we need to find out what the empirical evidence is that Kent and other creationists would accept, that would falsify it as a scientific theory and would move it across Popper's line of demarcation from science to religion. It seems to me like the empirical evidence is overwhelming in support of an evolution theory.
What you're referring to is
in
empirical
support
evidence.
of macroevolution in particular.
You think there's empirical evidence for macroevolution? Is that what you said? I didn't catch that last.
Yes, I think there's overwhelming empirical.
Would you please give me an example?
Okay. Would you consider humans and chimps two distinct kinds?
I would consider humans and chimps two distinct kinds, absolutely.
Then why is there this level of genetic similarity between the two? But I really don't need to ask you that question.
I'd like to have the question.
The challenge is, though, is that a test of a prediction of evolution theory? And evolution theory predicts that all species arose from previously existing ancestral species, and that means that they not only acquired their anatomy by a process of modification through evolution from the common ancestor, and so one should see homology at that level, but you should see homology at the genetic level as well. And moreover, if independently we had a phylogeny that told us that there was a particular order in which a particular set of species arose based on anatomical studies, and so it's independent of the molecular data, then molecular data comes along decades later, and we use that to generate a phylogeny in the same way, and the two are identical. I consider that strong support for a continuity. And this is really what the test of macroevolution is. It's continuity versus discontinuity across kinds.
Dr. Hovind?
The humans and chimps, I would say, are different kinds of animals. I would not argue there are literally thousands and thousands of differences. You chose to look at the DNA sequence between humans and chimps, and it is a certain percentage of similarity there. I could point out that a watermelon is 97% water, and a cloud is 100% water, only 3% difference, and a snow cone is 98% water, as is a jellyfish, by the way. So snow cones and jellyfish are identical if you want to make the water content the criteria. If you're wanting to make the DNA the criteria for humans and chimps, that's fine. There are a lot of similarities. To me, it's pretty obvious. There's a common designer. I would say there's thousands of similarities between different computer programs that are all produced by Microsoft. Not because they all evolved, from hieroglyphics, but because the same guys are designing these programs. That's why.